let's talk about a financial tool that's both brilliant and, well, infamous. It's something that completely reshaped global banking, and it was right at the heart of the 2008 financial crisis. We're diving into the mechanics of securitization.
It all starts with something super simple, something many of us have done. You take out a loan, maybe for a house or a car. You make your monthly payments, and you probably think, okay, that's the end of the story. But it's not. For the bank, that loan is now an asset on their books. And believe me, it's about to go on a pretty wild journey.
And that journey? It's called securitization. Now, I know it sounds super complicated, but at its core, it's a really clever piece of financial engineering that turns something you can't just sell, like your mortgage, into something you can.
So what is it really? Well, put simply, securitization is just a process for taking illiquid assets, things like a 30-year mortgage that are locked up and can't be easily traded, and packaging them up into investments or securities that can be bought and sold. It's kind of like financial alchemy, turning thousands of individual long-term IOUs into a single sellable product. Okay, so how does this alchemy actually work? The best way to get your head around it is to picture a kind of financial assembly line. It's this very structured four-step process that takes the raw materials, in this case, all those loans, and turns them into a finished product for the market. So here's how that assembly line works. First up, the originator, that's your bank, bundles your mortgage together with thousands of others into one giant pool. Then, and this next step is absolutely crucial, the bank sells that entire pool to a totally separate company, what's called a special purpose vehicle, or SPV. Now, this SPV takes the stream of cash flowing in from all those loan payments and slices it up into different pieces called tranches. Think of it like a cake with different layers of risk. Finally, these brand new securities get sold off to investors on the open market. Now, that second step, selling the loans to the SPV, that's the real magic trick here. It makes these new investments bankruptcy remote. What that means is, if the original bank that made the loans goes bust, the investors who bought the securities are protected. The loans are legally walled off, creating a firewall between the bank's problems and the assets themselves. It's a huge innovation.
Okay, that sounds like a ton of work, right? A lot of legal and financial hoops to jump through. So why do banks go through all this trouble? What's the real motivation behind this whole complex machine?
Well, it really boils down to three huge advantages for the banks. First, funding. Instead of waiting 30 years for you to pay off your mortgage, they get a big chunk of cash right now. Second, managing their balance sheet. By selling the loans, they free up their own money, which means they can turn around and make even more loans. And third, risk management. The risk that you might stop paying your loan, that gets transferred from the bank's books to the investors who bought these new securities.
And that benefit of freeing up capital, man, that was a game changer. Back in the day, under banking rules known as Basel I, banks had to keep at least $8 in reserve for every $100 of risky loans they held. But by securitizing those loans, basically selling them, poof, they didn't have to hold that capital anymore. This regulatory capital relief was a massive incentive that helped the whole practice just explode. Funding, efficiency, risk management, it all sounds pretty great on paper. But as we all know, there is a much, much darker side to this story. Because this incredibly powerful financial tool is forever tied to the 2008 global financial crisis. But here's the thing, and this is probably the most critical point to understand. Securitization in itself does not change the risk of an underlying asset class. Let me say that again. Packaging up 1,000 risky mortgages doesn't magically make them safe. The risk is still there. This tells us the tool itself, it wasn't the real problem. So if the assembly line itself wasn't fundamentally broken, how on earth did it end up producing a catastrophe that brought the entire global economy to its knees? What went so wrong? Well, the problem wasn't the tool, it was how it was being used. You had this shadow banking system pop up, where the person making the loan had zero reason to care if the borrower could actually pay it back. They just sold it off immediately. Then, the system was pumped full of insane amounts of borrowed money, or leverage, sometimes $50 for every $1 a bank actually had. The securities themselves became so complex that almost nobody truly understood the risk buried inside. And the cherry on top? The credit rating agencies, the supposed referees, were stamping these incredibly risky packages with their highest, safest AAA rating. So after playing such a central role in a global meltdown, you'd think this financial tool would be banished, right? Put on the scrap heap of bad ideas forever? But that's not what happened.
let's look at how securitization actually survived and even found a whole new purpose.
Yeah, far from disappearing, securitization just adapted. The basic mechanism was simply too useful to throw away. So the financial system figured out a new way to use the exact same technology.
After the crisis, banks started making these assets in-house, so they'd still bundle up their own loans, but, and here's the twist, they didn't sell the securities to investors. They kept them. And why would they do that? Simple. They could use these brand new, high-quality securities as collateral to get really important short-term funding from central banks. The tool went from being a risk transfer machine to a liquidity creation machine for the banks themselves.
And you can see how the public market for these things totally changed too. By 2009, those risky subprime mortgages, they made up just a tiny 1% of new deals. Instead, the market was all about more stable stuff, like auto loans and credit card debt. The assembly line was still humming along, it was just processing very different raw materials. Which leaves us with this incredible paradox, doesn't it? The very same financial technology that supercharged risk and helped trigger a global crisis is now a routine tool used by banks to create safe assets that help keep that same system stable. So what is it? Is securitization a villain we should fear, or is it a vital, if misunderstood, necessity for a modern economy? That's the question to really chew on.